My agenda is hyper Bitcoinization.
So bullish.
I do not have an agenda. I was invited to speak and I said yes.
Perfect. Well, we should start from the beginning shortly. So maybe what got you into Bitcoin and what's changed since you got into Bitcoin?
So my childhood was dominated by two main events. The first event was the 2008 financial collapse. Um, and that basically showed me that there's a bunch of people who pretend to be experts that know everything that's going to happen. And they really have no idea. And when things go against their expectations after the fact, they say, well, no one could have realized it. As I've aged, plenty of people realized that 2008 could happen and would happen at some point. Maybe they didn't know it was going to happen at, when it happened. But a lot of people saw that kind of situation happening. They saw the recklessness that was happening. But the mainstream, a lot of experts that were tapped by the mainstream chose to ignore those facts. The second main event that happened was the 2013 Snowden leaks. And what that showed me was up until that point, I was kind of like a mainstream tech nerd geek type of guy. But I trusted our large corporations to protect our interests. I didn't think they were perfect. I knew our governments were spying on us. I knew that corporations had certain monetization models that involved collecting our data, but I didn't realize the two were working in tandem, often with gag orders, the things that Snowden showed us. So those two things combined kind of put me, especially at the age I was at that point, put me in a kind of hopelessness, kind of discouraged situation where I didn't really see a way out. I just saw that there'd be chaos and that we were mostly powerless. Then I discovered Bitcoin. And to me, Bitcoin was basically my entry into the greater open source ecosystem. So I've found a tool that we could verify ourselves, that we didn't have to trust large corporations or governments. We didn't have to trust maybe a single entity that was saying they were benevolent, but you don't actually know if they're benevolent, like this idea of a benevolent dictator, which you see a lot in tech. Um, and that gave me hope. I still didn't think at that point that Bitcoin could work. When I first discovered Bitcoin, I think it happens to a lot of people. When I first discovered Bitcoin, I was like, well, this is just going to be crushed. It's going to be absolutely crushed. It's a great concept, but it'll never work. And I basically just went down the road and I just kept trying to figure out ways that it could break. And as I did that, my conviction grew. And as time went on, a lot of the concerns I had started to dissipate, because a lot of them were based around adoption and getting through certain, key hurdles in Bitcoin's growth cycle. And basically, I just went all in. I got obsessed with it. I not When I say all in, I don't just mean financially. I mean my whole life just became dominated by Bitcoin and the parallel open source ecosystem. Um, and then the rest is history. At this point, it's not even whether Bitcoin will succeed or not. We need open source tools to succeed. If we don't have them, we're absolutely screwed.
What year was this that you started to get all in with your headspace as well as your finances? When did you really start to go down the rabbit hole?
It was 2013. 2013 was I first discovered Bitcoin in 2012. I think the Snowden leaks were around there. I think it was like 2012, 2013. But in 2012, I was pretty much, that's where I started, where I was like, nah, this can't work. And 2013 was when I started to really realize, I guess there was another event that happened, which was the sports betting, all the sports betting bans that happened in the United States. And the way those bans happened were they went after the payment providers. And the same thing happened to WikiLeaks. They went after the payment providers. They didn't actually make sports betting illegal. Um, they just decided to close off the financial on ramps and off ramps for these organizations. So to me, basically, the most basic understanding of Bitcoin was, even if this thing is just for sports betting, even if this thing is just a means of an end to deposit and withdraw from websites that maybe aren't allowed in the United States, it's a massive improvement for people. And I kind of just took it from there. From there, that was like my first acceptance that Bitcoin could work. That Bitcoin was, maybe not that Bitcoin could work, that Bitcoin was needed. There was a need for it.
So have you always felt kind of like this social impulse to adopt Bitcoin, but also to do what you could to promote it so that others could have the benefits from it? I mean, outside of number go up technology, just
Yeah, I've always thought of it. I always thought of it as, um, I guess maybe in the beginning I was coming at it from more selfish role, or selfish perspective, which is good. That's one of the reasons I love Bitcoin, is because it basically, that's the only assumption it makes, is that everyone will be selfish, which I think is like basically the only safe assumption you can make about people. And I think since then, uh, it should be pretty apparent to many people that if your system is based on benevolence, if your system is based on just good faith, it'll probably fail in the long term. But I quickly came to the conclusion, like we had the Snowden leaks. We had the Snowden leaks, and you came to this. I came to this conclusion that if we're in a world without Bitcoin, that's a dystopia. If we're in a world without open source tools that are easily accessible and easy to use, that's a dystopia. And you start to think, I'm going to have children in the future. I'm going to have grandchildren. What kind of world are they going to live in? What is a more important fight than empowering individuals to stand up for themselves and take back sovereignty? So, I mean, up until like 2017, I was more low key. I tried to. I had many NIMs. I didn't use my face. My face wasn't visible. Um, and part of that reason was because I thought the U.S. government was going to. I'm an American, so it was immediately, they're the immediate organization that I was thinking of. But I thought my government was going to come after Bitcoiners. They still might, but I thought they were going to come after us really hard, which they didn't. And in 2017, it kind of seemed like we had crossed the Rubicon and that wasn't going to happen. And I went full steam ahead in basically education efforts, because with these kind of systems, I mean, they're networks, right? And if we don't have many people using encryption, if we don't have many people using Bitcoin, the tool isn't very useful for everyone else. You need a lot of people to use it, and you need them to be educated to use it in a, and I don't want to say proper manner because that's subjective, but use it in a like a safe and secure manner, use it in an effective manner, use it efficiently, right? And basically be able to think for themselves rather than just blindly trust whatever someone else says. They need to be able to assess these things themselves and try and use them based on their own threat models. So it became really apparent to me that one of the biggest things we were hurting on was a lot of the public Bitcoin proponents. And this is what 2017, it was very apparent because we had SegWit 2x happen, we had Bcash happen. A lot of the public Bitcoin proponents didn't care about that. They only cared about enriching themselves. Um, and basically, it's way easier to monetize people if they're cattle rather than free men. Like if they'll listen to everything you say, you can sell them any piece of shit you want to sell them to, and always the shit is always the highest paid stuff that they'll give you. So I basically came to the conclusion. I started to complain about it in my own head. And then I came to the conclusion. I was like, if I'm complaining about it, I got to do something about it. And I'm kind of, to be honest, I've come to the conclusion maybe like earlier this year, um, that we're starting to hit the point where there's a lot of other people that have stepped up, and it gives me great peace to know that, maybe I'm not as necessary as I was in the beginning.
yeah. As our system grows, there was one point I wanted to circle back to you with you. It seems to me that banks are going to downplay the need for what would be traditional network participants to custody their own wealth. Like you'll see more and more headlines of banks offering services and applications, ways for you to buy Bitcoin, um, and hold it through them. And what kind of effect do you think this will have? Do you think the vast majority of people in the future are going to have a third party custody their Bitcoin in a sort of counterintuitive reversal?
That was the biggest thing I got wrong from my early days in Bitcoin. Was I thought the threat was outright bans. Um, and that never really materialized. It could still materialize, but that never really materialized. What the reality is, what we're looking at now is the easiest way to neuter the power of Bitcoin is to give people an alternative that's convenient and cheaper, um, and hope the majority of people use it to basically neuter the network effect, right? And in Bitcoin, you also have the advantage that if you're able to destroy the privacy of an overwhelming majority of people, you can use that information in like a process of elimination type of way to go after the people that are still using Bitcoin in a self-sovereign way. So it has been extremely effective, and it's going to only get even more effective. I mean, we see PayPal just added support, Venmo just added support, quote unquote support for Bitcoin, right? But you can't withdraw. And even if you could withdraw, there's going to be major limits on how you can withdraw, and there's going to be tons of surveillance attached to that. So the overwhelming majority of people right now are being onboarded in these systems, in these controlled, isolated type of systems that are pretending that you're getting Bitcoin. But you're not getting most of the benefits of Bitcoin, if any, right? You're getting maybe some kind of inflation hedge. But in a hyperinflation environment, you might not even get to realize the beauty of that inflation hedge, because it could just get pulled away from you in a heartbeat. It could be frozen. It could be taxed into oblivion. It can be absolutely destroyed for you personally, while the network is completely fine. So I do think that's the biggest threat right now, and we're watching it play out in real time. And I think, unfortunately, just to go back to what we were saying earlier, is that a lot of the public personalities benefit individually for pushing you into those systems, right? That's why you see so many podcasts sponsored by BlockFi, or you see people shilling ref links or whatnot, or saying that it's bullish if we have, Venmo allowing you to buy Bitcoin IOUs, because it's an easy path for individual monetization. But at the end of the day, it's hurting those users. It's a risk for those users.
Yeah, and they don't realize it, right? That's the cattle like aspect. It's giving the people the illusion of progress and really, you know, keeping hold of the rug under their feet. It's kind of frightening. So what do you think? Do you think that that's the biggest threat to Bitcoin right now? Is that it's sort of being co-opted and rebranded a little bit cheaper and a little bit sort of more digestible form through institutions?
I think it's a bigger threat for shitcoins than it is for Bitcoin. Um, because shitcoin's actual development and updates and changes are heavily influenced by a lot of these organizations. The Segwit 2x drama really showed that one of the main value props of Bitcoin is that it's hard to change. Is that perfect? Is Bitcoin perfect? Could it be better? Sure, I could definitely. There's plenty of ways that Bitcoin could be better. Um, but at the end of the day, I think it is good enough, and the fact that it's hard to change makes it resistant to those types of attacks. Um, the biggest threat to me from that, the reason it's such a big threat is because it's a threat to the individual users, right? It's a threat to the individual people that are trying to seek protection in Bitcoin. They're trying to seek empowerment through Bitcoin. And instead, they're being diverted into this corralled kind of environment. Um, I'm not sure. I and then tangentially, it could affect other Bitcoin users that are sovereign users, because they could be easier targets in that kind of environment as it develops, as it goes further down. If we see like a world where you can only withdraw into verified addresses, or maybe you can't even withdraw at all, right? You basically create a situation where using Bitcoin the way I think it was intended to be using, but using Bitcoin in a self-sovereign way becomes de facto criminalized. And we've seen in the drug wars, just because you make something illegal doesn't stop it. Um, but you can make those people's lives hell, right? You can make them de facto criminals and cut them off from all these other services. So I expect basically like a two-pronged situation where on one side you basically corral unsuspecting users into these closed platforms, and on the second side you de facto criminalize self-sovereign users. And I still think we'll win, but I think it's going to be really messy, and it could be very painful for individual Bitcoiners, including myself, especially myself, because we're public Bitcoiners, right? Like we're known Bitcoiners that put our face on this thing.
Yeah. Um, that reminds me of places like Turkey, Cyprus, India, where you see these bans enacted, and immediately what occurs is that a black market and the price of Bitcoin in those countries rises. So, on the flip side of this, I think it's interesting that we'll soon have um, people who were essentially raised, not many of them, but some who were raised on a Bitcoin standard are going to be entering their teens here within the next 5 years. I mean, from what I can tell, people who really understand the technology in the way that you do, and see it as a tool for self-sovereignty and just more freedom, it's very hard to unsee. So I'm reassured by the fact that we're not losing numbers. There aren't exactly notes coming offline en masse.
Right. I mean, I think that is our advantage long term, right? I think short term, there's a very big incentive, engagement wise, and also um, monetarily, in terms of trying to increase Bitcoin's uh, fiat price in the short term, to overstate how many sovereign Bitcoiners we have. I think that number is way smaller than most people expect. Um, and I think for better or for worse, because Bitcoin has had a relatively welcoming environment among Western governments, sophisticated governments. Um, we're not necessarily as prepared as we could be if we were a black market for a period of time, right? When you're a black market in most of the world, you start to realize where all your holes are and you start to try and patch them up, right? But a lot of Bitcoiners right now are living in a complacency world where we haven't really been outwardly attacked yet. And I don't think it was an intentional strategy. I think, governments are filled with old people and bureaucracies, and they're very slow to move. And they kind of ignored it. They thought it was a joke. Um, but when the heel starts to step on us, it's going to happen quicker than we like. And we need as many Bitcoiners to be prepared as possible. Now, the younger generation in general usually will be more sophisticated and prepared for these types of things. I remember, when I was growing up, like my parents tried to, control my computer usage or whatever. But the joke was on them. Like if I wanted to, I could have controlled their computer usage. Like they had no chance. They had no chance to control me. Um, the only issue though is a lot of our children are being brought up into these kind of closed silo systems. So when we were younger, I know we're kind of similar ages. When we were younger, computers didn't really have, they were rough around the edges. You had to know how to like kind of get them to work for you and get them to use. Now, a lot of youth just think that the systems are so polished and so convenient. They think, they just sign in with their Apple password, and it should just work. They don't need to know. It's all hidden from them. They don't have to really know. So it's a smaller subset that are actually investigating and trying to figure out like how it works under the hood.
And that the cost of that convenience is, as you said, it's hidden from them.
Yeah, it's always our whole life is filled with this convenience versus privacy security trade-off, where the more convenient option will almost always sacrifice privacy and security to give you more convenience. And it's the human condition to just seek out the more convenient, cheaper option. It's just how humans are pre-programmed. And they'll only I'm a strong believer that the overwhelming majority of people will not improve their situation unless they have to. There needs to be a need. There's no reason for them to forsake the convenience, forsake the cheap, the lower cost, the lower entry cost, the lower usage costs, unless there's an absolute need for them to figure out an alternative. And we see parallels all the time. I mean, in the early days of email, right? You could run your own email server. And then Gmail was like, you can just use us for free. We're going to scan your emails, but you could use us for free and we'll give you unlimited storage. You can keep as much, never delete an email ever again. Right. And the overwhelming majority of people chose that option. Now, when the Snowden leaks happened, some people moved off of Gmail, right? Because they realized what was happening. Now, that wasn't really as much of a burn. If we saw, and we will, when you start seeing these mass data leaks happen, we had the so-called fappening, where all the iCloud information of celebrities, like all their iCloud pictures got compromised, right? You can bet that those celebrities, after that happened, made sure that their photos were secure after that, right? A more serious example, like if you're an activist in China and you see that Google is getting compromised by the Chinese government, you see that Apple is handing over iCloud information to the Chinese government, and it puts you and your family in danger, you will figure out an alternative. And I think as more of our lives get digitized, we're going to see more and more of these situations where people get burned. And it's only a matter of time before we start seeing wide scale movement to basically open source, privacy focused, sovereignty focused alternatives. And our goal as educators, our goal as people in this ecosystem that want to see it grow, should be to have the tools ready, should be to have the educational materials ready. And rather than basically try and court people into it, have that stuff ready. And when they realize the need, as they realize the need, they will come to us. They will seek out the tools and they will learn how to use them.
So does it follow that the most private user of Bitcoin is the most sovereign?
Probably. I don't like talking in absolutes. But there's definitely a connection between privacy and sovereignty, because a lack of privacy represents a vulnerability, right? And in the Bitcoin world, I spend a lot of time focused on Bitcoin privacy and Bitcoin privacy shortcomings and how you can use Bitcoin with privacy best practices in mind. And that's because in Bitcoin, we like to say, Bitcoin is unseizable money. Bitcoin is censorship resistant. Like no one can stop you from sending Bitcoin around the world. But if your Bitcoin is known, if your addresses are known, if all your transactions are tracked, you might be able to send a transaction without permission, but you're just going to end up in jail right afterwards, right? You might not necessarily implicitly have to ask permission to send your transaction, but if you're scared of the repercussions of your transaction, if you're scared of the repercussions of your messages, you're sending a message to someone rather than encrypting it, and that message is known. If you start self-censoring yourself. You either start self-censoring yourself or you get censored after the fact, through jail time, through financial repercussions, through all sorts of different tools that can be used after the fact, to basically make you bend the knee, right? So privacy is very integral to a security setup. Depending on your threat model, the amount of privacy could vary. But I think it's an absolutely key component of it. And that's why my focus isn't just on Bitcoin. Like I don't focus on shitcoins, but the parallel open source tools, stuff like encryption, stuff like self-sovereign file storage, um, even simple things like people think about like maps, like using Google Maps, your location data is everywhere, right? So like, oh, maybe your Bitcoin privacy is perfect, but if a malicious actor knows where you live, where you work, where everyone you love lives, where everyone you love works, like how sovereign are you? Like you're not that sovereign in that situation.
Yeah. Yeah. So what, in your mind, are some of the basic, and I'm sure you've talked about this on your other channels, but what are some of the most basic privacy steps that every Bitcoiner should take?
I think the number one thing people need to realize is that Bitcoin isn't just inherently private, right? You have to realize there's an issue first. Um, I don't even think I am, you know, I don't even think I'm effective enough to, be private from a, I don't think most people are effective enough to be private from a truly sophisticated actor, right? But you can't let that discourage you. You can't think like, "Oh, I can't be perfect, so I'm not going to try." You have to take you should take, you don't have to. You could do whatever the fuck you want to do. You should take actionable steps to slowly improve your privacy over time. Cut out major things, major issues like using Google tools, like allowing your location to be easily tracked, reduce your social media usage. These are all very simple things that we're all, most of us are all vulnerable from, that we all expose ourselves to, usually out of our own volition. We like go and do those things. So I think it starts with just an understanding why privacy is important, how much private data we're allowing to leak from our daily lives, and starting to just try and think from our own perspective how we can reduce those holes, how we can live a more private life before you even get started with Bitcoin, right? But then if we're going to jump into Bitcoin privacy specifically, the number one thing that people suffer from is that they get onboarded through these KYC regulated exchanges, and they know your full identity. A lot of them make you take a selfie, maybe a 3D selfie. They make you do a passport scan. You give like the blood of your firstborn child. And then they know, they know all of your transaction history after that fact. If you don't take any privacy precautions going forward after that, they're going to see everything. Um, so that's when the Bitcoin privacy tools come into play. But if you can avoid KYC, you want to avoid it as much as possible, if not completely. Um, and that's what most people will never tell you. That's a major first step. And I think that's something that kind of gets solved long term as we have more of a circular economy. But you still have an issue in that situation because if someone pays you or you pay someone else, you have insight into their future transactions and their past transactions. So it's not just for users who are coming in via regulated entities, even though the overwhelming majority are. So I think that's the most tangible thing that people should get away from it. But even if you're in a purely circular economy, you're going to need to know how to use Bitcoin with privacy best practices. Otherwise, your boss is going to know all your spending habits, and like the guy you go buy a sandwich from at the convenience store is going to know your salary, and no one wants that situation to happen. I think that's a pretty tangible thing that people realize. Like the convenience store guy should know how much money you make. So if you don't take those precautions yourself, no one else will take them for you. And you have to start doing the research and start trying to improve your setup day after day to try and give yourself as little privacy leakage as possible.
And what are your go-to resources for that? I mean, you've been doing this for so long, but let's say someone has just grasped the concept of self-custody. They've got their first hardware wallet and they want to go to buy some KYC free Bitcoin. What do they do?
Well, it's hard to buy KYC free Bitcoin. We have BISC. Rather than list out specific tools, um, I have a list of resources on my website, civdispatch.com/help, that I like. It also includes a list of tools. I like bitcoiner.guide/privacy. He has a bunch of tools there, or she, I don't know. He's a nim. Those are two great places to start. I think, yeah, I think at the end of the day, there's no one size fits all approach for people. Um, the number one thing, see, and here's the thing, it's like we're talking to so many different levels of individuals and with different skill sets, right? I guess before I even said KYC, what I really should have said is you should be self-custodying. You should be holding your own keys. You shouldn't give someone, if you give someone custody of your funds, um, you have no expectation of privacy. You will never get privacy. In America, I mean, I'm very American focused because I'm American. We have the Fourth Amendment, which says you're not subject to unreasonable search and seizure without a warrant, unless you give that information to a third party. That's called the third party doctrine. You don't have any expectation of privacy if you give it to a third party. So it's important to realize for people that when I talk about this stuff, this is not an issue specific to Bitcoin. In our everyday lives, it is something that you don't even have an option for. If you're using Venmo, you're not going to get any privacy. If you're using your bank account, you're not going to get any privacy. And you can't self-custody that either. It's impossible for you to self-custody. So what's nice is Bitcoin gives you options. Will everyone choose those options? Will everyone choose sovereignty? No. But at least they have the options on the table when they realize they need them.
Yeah. Super eye-opening, especially when you first get into it. I remember I felt I had to backstep a little bit when I first got into Bitcoin. I was under the misimpression that it was anonymous, and then I very quickly started to realize, like, how can this is not anonymous. This is pseudonymous at best. And the places that I'm going for it initially are not at all. There's So what do you think the solution is to these commercial enterprises? And maybe we're circling back too much, but that just have so much cash to throw at campaigns to basically lead people in the wrong direction and to steer them to corporations rather than to their own freedom. I mean, how do you, besides stealing the monetary power and the store of value from these corporations, what do we do collectively as Bitcoiners?
Look, I think you kind of nailed it on the head there, that, one of the biggest issues is that people don't realize that there's a privacy risk, right? And the biggest mistakes people make, they tend to make in a situation where they think they have privacy and they don't have privacy. So they're more, they get more exposed. They release more information because they think it's private. And in Bitcoin land, we believe Bitcoin's going to last forever. We believe it's going to outlive us, right? So if we're in that situation, just because you can leak information today, and that information might not be used against you for 5 to 10 years, right? It could be used against you in the future at some point. You could leak information that maybe isn't even actionable by a malicious actor until 5 years from now. Like, they can't figure out how to use it right now, but they'll figure out how to use it in the future. So to me, in Bitcoin land, it's even more prudent for us to be moving quickly here, on educating people and getting people to use better privacy best practices. In terms of big money interests, big money influencers, kind of corralling people into these controlled systems, I mean, that's inevitable. That's going to happen. It is happening. It will continue to happen. We have to do our best on the outside to try and basically do the opposite and educate people. But I think ultimately, long term, what happens is everyone's going to get burned. PayPal doesn't want to censor your transactions. PayPal would love if every single person could use PayPal. They censor your transactions because they have no other option. They're compelled to censor your transactions. And every single large entity that is centrally controlled, that is easy to put pressure on, will ultimately do that kind of thing. And when they do that kind of thing, when data leaks on you, because it's in a centralized cloud storage server, or when your transactions get censored or your messages get censored because it's controlled by a centralized entity that can regulate your speech, that's when people are going to wake up and realize there's a need and they will look for an alternative. So long term, we have that going for us. Unfortunately, people are going to get burned. That the thesis is that people get burned, and that's why it happens.
One question that emerges from that for me is, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and misguided anger towards capitalism in general. You see kind of like this hilarious young person movement of like Marxist, quote unquote, and like anti-capitalist behavior. And I think some of that frustration just comes from a sense of helplessness. What do you think as a proponent of self-sovereignty and just the freedom maximalist? What do you think of the end result of free markets if what emerges from them is these huge, mega corporations? Even under a Bitcoin standard, right? Someone will always rise to the top.
I think we've never really seen truly free markets in the modern age. I think Bitcoin is going to enable truly free markets. I think Bitcoin is already kind of enabling them. I think the Bitcoin markets are some of the most free in the world. I think you can trade with anyone globally without permission, without a centralized third party, if you want to. Most people don't, but you could. That wasn't really possible before Bitcoin existed. I think the issue is not these large corporations. The issue is that these large corporations basically have de facto monopolies that are granted by governments to them, whether implicitly or because regulations are so burdensome that there becomes a regulatory moat where it's really hard to have a competitor pop up. And we see that all the time. We see that in the Bitcoin world. Coinbase basically got through the door. They were the first, regulated exchange in America. And then they closed the door behind them and they got the bit license through. They made it sure that no one else can open up an exchange very easily in America. And you see that all throughout, especially in the tech industries in America, but also throughout the Western world. So I think that if we actually had free competition, would it be all rosy and perfect? No, of course not. It'd be messy. I think a proper free market is messy, but I think it's fair, and we don't have that right now. People need options. You should have options. If you have no options, then you're just giving the illusion of free will. You're giving the illusion of choice, but you don't really have any choice.
Yeah. Going forward, what do you think? Are you a future guy? Do you have any bullish predictions, any bearish predictions, any kind of predictions?
Well, recently I've had egg on my face because a bunch of my predictions were not great. Um, Look, the way I look at it is I think future predictions don't really matter that much because a future without open source tools, without tools that you can use without a third party, is just going to be a straight dystopia. So I think we don't really have an option. I think we have to fight for individual freedoms. Freedom was never given to anyone. Freedom is taken and defended, and we need to fight for them. And if we don't, the alternative is horrible. So unfortunately, I think that the short to medium term is going to be messy regardless. But I think we can help build a future long term where individuals have more freedom and more happiness, where they just have more happiness, where they can raise their children and they can do whatever the hell they want with their lives, our very short lives, and live them to the fullest. And I think there's no better goal than that. That is the ultimate goal to me. And I believe it will come to fruition. I just hope it's not as messy as it could be in the short to medium term, right? Like there's different paths we could take here. And it depends how much the traditional powers that be decide to fight back. The ideal would be as little people get burned as possible. But the long-term bullish thesis is even if people get burned, they will learn a lesson because they get burned.
I think that's been a wealth of information. I really appreciate it. Is there any last statements you want to make, or anything you wanted to add about Bitcoin today?
I think it's absolutely imperative that every single person has a Bitcoin strategy. If you care about yourself, if you care about your loved ones, if you care about your friends, if you care about the society you grow up in, um, you need to have a Bitcoin strategy. If you don't have a Bitcoin strategy, it's going to be very tough for you in the future. You need to have an open source strategy. You need to care about your privacy. No one else will do these things for you. You can, ignorance is bliss is a very good is a very good meme. It's true. I wish I was just ignorant to it all and I could just ignore it and I could just live a nice blissful life. But eventually it won't be blissful anymore and you will get hit hard at that point. So it's up to you, it's up to the people you care about to lift themselves up and make this shit happen. You're gonna have to do it yourself. There's no easy road. There's a bunch of people that will sell you an easy road to success, but there isn't. And you have to care about yourself, and you have to care about the people you care about, the people you love. Otherwise, no one else will.
Okay, Mr. Matt Odell, what is your bullish take on Bitcoin?
Bitcoin represents hope. We need Bitcoin. If we don't have Bitcoin, we're absolutely fucked. But what most people care about is the financial case for Bitcoin. And at the end of the day, Bitcoin is the most scarce asset that has ever existed. There has never been anything more scarce than Bitcoin. And the overwhelming majority of people have not realized that yet. So if you don't have a Bitcoin accumulation strategy, if you don't have a strategy that involves being able to hold your Bitcoin through chaos without it getting taken away from you, you're not going to have a fun time. You need to get on that right now, because as far as I'm concerned, every single other asset will trend to zero against Bitcoin long term. Whether that's the Chrysler building, whether that's your favorite shitcoin, whether that's Apple stock, it's all going to trend to zero in terms of Bitcoin. It'll still have value, but it'll have much less value when you compare it to the purchasing power of Bitcoin. So I think every single person, especially young people, should be focused on trying to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible and learn how to use it with privacy best practices. Otherwise, it could be taken away from you in the future.